Hey everyone, so if you're new to using your DSLR and you're trying to figure out how to shoot manually, today's video is for you because I'm going to share with you the triangle of exposure. Also, I want you guys to know that I do have a free download for you. So if you go to the description, you'll find a link that you can download a visual of how the triangle of exposure works. So if you're more of a visual person, that's going to help you out a lot more as opposed to hearing me talk. So go down to that link and you can get that free download. All right, so let me break this down for you a little bit. So when you shoot in full manual mode on your camera, there are three main things that you have to keep in mind. And that's called the triangle of exposure because those three things all affect how a photo is exposed. So those three things are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So let me share with you what each of those things do and how they affect your exposure and overall how your image is going to look. Alright, so the first thing is shutter speed. This is basically how fast your camera is taking the photo, like your shutter, how fast it is. So basically what the shutter speed does is you want it to be higher when you're taking photos of something in motion. So if the shutter speed is really low, let's say you have it at 100, if you take some photo of someone running, then they're going to be pretty blurry because your shutter speed is really slow. It wasn't fast enough to capture that motion. If you wanted to capture that motion and for it to be nice and crisp and clear and not blurry, you would want your shutter speed to be probably at like 500 or above 500, for example. So I usually keep, as a photographer, my shutter speed at around 250, and I don't go much below that unless I absolutely have to, and I really prefer to have my shutter speed really high. There's really no other advantage or disadvantage to having your shutter speed higher or lower. If you go really low, it's just going to be really blurry from your shaking your camera. That's what you're going to get blurry from. But if you have your shutter speed at 4,000, there's no disadvantage to that. The only other thing with shutter speed is the higher the number, the darker the exposure. So when you have your shutter speed down at 250, your exposure is going to be a lot lighter than when it's at 4,000. So typically, if you're shooting outside and it's a bright sunny day, having your shutter speed of 4,000 is going to be great. But if you're shooting inside, it's going to be a little darker. There's not much natural light, so you're probably going to want your shutter speed at around 250 or even a little lower if you can keep your hands super steady and not have camera shake. All right, and then the second thing that we're going to chat about is aperture. And this definitely depends on the lens you're using as far as how low you can go. So when I say low, that means the lower the number. And the lower the number your aperture is, the blurrier your background's going to be. So if you've ever seen photos with really pretty blurry backgrounds and they have bokeh, like those little round circles of light in the background, and it just looks so dreamy, that's how they're doing it. They're having really low apertures, pulling your subject away from the background so that it goes blurry. So that's how they're really achieving that. Now, the lenses you have affect this because a lot of the like kit lenses you'll get with your DSLR, they will only go down to like 3.5. That's not going to get you a very blurry background. So if you're really wanting a blurrier background, having a lens that can go down to 1.4 or 1.8 is really going to achieve that for you. I know Nikon and Canon has a beginner starter lens that's only like less than $200, which isn't very much for a camera lens. And I'll have links to those two in the description so that you can check those out if you're interested in buying one. But those are my favorite lenses, what I started with when I started shooting professionally, and it's still my favorite lens. I have an upgraded 50mm that I love. Alright, and so with aperture, as far as how it affects the exposure, the lower the number of the aperture, the brighter your exposure is going to be. So if it's at 2.0, your exposure is going to be even brighter. And if you have it at, let's just say like 6.0, your exposure is going to be a lot darker and you're not going to have as blurry of backgrounds, if that makes sense. So the only thing with having your aperture really low at 2.0, you do have to do a lot more practice because it can be more difficult to have things in focus because there's a smaller plane that things can be in focus. So what I mean by plane is the reason that you get those blurry backgrounds is when your aperture is at 1.8, it's going to be a lot thinner of a plane that you're actually getting in the photo. So if I was shooting something, then and it's at 1.8, you're going to get like this much in focus in the plane that you're shooting. But when you put your aperture up, then it's going to come wider and wider and wider, and you'll get more things in focus, if that makes sense. So that's why the backgrounds become less blurry. So you just have to be careful when you are shooting at low apertures, like at 2.0, because it can be easy to get out of focus. You constantly need to refocus. But with a little practice, it's really not too hard. All right, and then the third thing that adds to the triangle of exposure is called ISO. So ISO basically is another way to either brighten your photo or darken your photo, and the higher the number the ISO is, the brighter the photo, but this also adds grain. So that's what you have to be really careful about with ISO. I usually on my camera can go to about 1250 ISO without it getting too grainy. If I go too much above that, it starts to get grainier and grainier, and my style isn't really super grainy, it's more clean, so I try not to, and I'd rather bring out a flash or something. You really want your ISO to be as low as possible because you don't want it to be super grainy. So if you stay below that 1000 range, you're probably gonna be pretty good. So with how it exposes the photo, let's say you're shooting outside, you're probably gonna have your ISO at about 100, which is the lowest it can go, because there's no reason to bring it up any higher, and you can just bring your shutter speed up higher. You're gonna have nice clean photos with no grain. But then when you're inside, it's gonna be a little darker. Like I mentioned earlier, with the shutter speed, you probably have that at around 250. So then you're probably gonna wanna bring your ISO up a little higher. But like I said, you don't wanna bring it up too high or else it's gonna get grainier and grainier. So you have to play with this and see what your preference is. But for me, my rule of thumb is try not to go above 1250. I can go up to 3000 if I have to, but 1250 is where I like to stay at. It's my sweet spot. All right, so now that we've talked about how all of these things are and how they affect exposure, I'm gonna share a little bit about my thought process when I'm photographing and what settings I'm choosing and why I'm choosing them. The first thing I wanna do is I want my ISO to be as low as possible wherever I'm shooting. I don't wanna have to bring it above 1250. Like I mentioned, you can, it's just gonna get a little grainier. So my thought process is I would rather keep my ISO at 100, and then I don't want my shutter speed to go below 250. Remember, shutter speed is, if it's lower number, it makes it brighter. And ISO, if it's a lower number, it makes it darker. So those are the two rules of thumbs that I'm thinking in my mind. I want my ISO to be as low as possible, my shutter speed to be not go below 250. And if I have to, I can bring my shutter speed up. I would much rather do that than anything else. And then my aperture, because I'm a pretty light and airy photographer, I love my dreamy backgrounds with bokeh. I pretty much keep my aperture at 1.8 unless I'm shooting like landscapes or wide shots. Then I bring it up to 2.8 or 3.5. And as well as like bigger families, if I'm doing big family shots like at weddings, then I'll definitely bring that aperture up to get more people in focus. Like I mentioned with the plane earlier, you want to get more of the photo in focus on the plane you're focusing on. So if you have more people, you need it to be a little bit bigger. That's why I would bring my aperture up. But generally, I'm not bringing my shutter speed below 250. If I bring my shutter speed, let's say I have my shutter speed at 250 and my aperture at 1.8 and my ISO at 100. If it's still too dark, I don't want to bring my shutter speed any lower because I'm going to start getting camera shake because it's too low. And I don't want to bring my aperture any lower or higher because that's where I really like it. That means I'm going to bring my ISO up. And I'm going to bring my ISO up to 1250 if possible, if that's what I need to be able to have a well-lit photo. So on the flip side, let's say we're shooting not indoors like the previous situation, but we're going outside. So if my shutter speed was at 250, my ISO is at 100, my aperture is 1.8, just like last time. Those are the settings where I'll start with. And it's way too bright. You take a photo and it's basically white. So basically that means it's way too bright and it's way too overexposed. So to bring that down, I'm not going to bring my ISO down anymore because that's the lowest ISO I can go. I'm not going to bring my aperture up because I still want those really nice and creamy blurry backgrounds. So I want to bring my shutter speed up. And a lot of times when it's bright and sunny outside, I do have to bring it up to 4000, which is the highest it can go. So that's pretty much my thought process. And when I'm shooting outside and it's bright, there's really no disadvantage to bring your shutter speed up. If anything, it's better because there's a tiny risk of having camera shake. The higher the shutter speed, the less camera shake you'll have, or less likelihood of it. So it's actually better if you can bring your shutter speed up. Alright, so that was it. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, if you want a visual of how the triangle of exposure works and how to even do that and how to shoot in manual, feel free to hit that link below so you can subscribe to my email list and get that free download. If you're a visual person, that's going to help you out a lot as opposed to me just talking and rambling on. So I really hope this helps. If you have any questions about any of this or how it works, feel free to comment below. I'd love to answer them for you. As always, hit subscribe because I upload a new video every Tuesday. Bye guys!